Welcome back, everyone, to the Daily News Roundup. Lots to cover today, so let's dive right in. We've got international hostage situations, some political intrigue, a potential shakeup in the Catholic Church, and even a hockey rivalry with a political twist.
Wow, sounds like a busy news day.
It is. Let's start with that hostage crisis in Israel. Over the weekend, 6 Israeli hostages were released, including 4 from that terrible attack on the Nuva Music Festival back in 2023.
Right, and two of those released, Avera Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed, had been held for years, since 2014 and 2015, actually.
It's hard to even imagine what they and their families have been through.
Yeah.
There's also Tal Shoham, who you might remember, escaped initially, but then went back to try and rescue his friends.
Incredibly brave.
And Omer Wenkert, he was able to send messages to his family before being captured. These stories are really remarkable, but amidst this good news, there's also some cause for concern.
Yeah, Israeli PM Netanyahu announced he's delaying the planned release of Palestinian prisoners. He's citing repeated violations by Hamas.
This delay is obviously raising a lot of questions, like what exactly are these violations? And how could this impact the hostages who are still being held? What do you think?
Well, one of the big issues is Hamas using the hostage situation for propaganda, staging ceremonies, media events, things like that. Some see this as, exploiting the hostages and violating the agreement.
It definitely adds another layer of tension to an already, incredibly delicate situation. And then there's still Eden Alexander, that young Israeli-American soldier we're all hoping for his safe return.
Absolutely. And we can't forget the tragedy earlier this week when the bodies of other hostages were returned, Shiri Bibas and her 2 young sons.
Heartbreaking news. And it turns out forensic testing actually contradicted Hamas's claim that she was killed by Israeli bombing.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just adds another layer of complexity and sadness to this whole situation.
It really does. A grim reminder of the human cost of this conflict.
Shifting gears now, we've got a different kind of uncertainty gripping the world. Pope Francis, his health.
He's still in critical condition, isn't he? After that, what was it called? A prolonged asthma-like respiratory crisis.
Right. And it's more serious than they first thought. He has pneumonia in both lungs. They've even had to give him blood transfusions.
Wow.
The Vatican's been pretty transparent about his condition, releasing daily updates, which the Pope himself requested. But honestly, the tone of those updates, it's getting more concerning.
Yeah, Catholics around the world are definitely worried. This is a big year, the Jubilee year, with all sorts of events planned. The Pope's health comes first, of course, but his absence would have a huge impact.
Definitely. Let's move on to France now. There was a disturbing incident in Mulhouse.
Right, a stabbing attack. 1 person was killed and 3 police officers injured.
And the suspect, apparently he shouted Allahu Akbar during the attack, so authorities are investigating it as, well, a possible terrorist act.
Makes sense.
The victim, a 69-year-old Portuguese man, was just trying to stop the attack.
Wow, what a tragedy.
The suspect was on a terrorism watch list and had a deportation order against him. President Macron has strongly condemned the attack, calling it an Islamist terrorist attack, and, reaffirmed the government's commitment to fighting terrorism.
It's a reminder that this threat, it's still very real.
Absolutely. Now, remember Mohammed Amra, the Fly? He made that incredible escape from a police van last year.
Oh, yeah. 2 prison officers were killed, 3 others injured. That was a crazy story.
Well, get this, he's been caught.
Really?
Yeah. They finally arrested him in Romania after 9 months on the run.
9 months? That's a long time. Good to hear they caught him, though.
It is. His lawyer actually expressed surprise at the violence during the escape, said it didn't really fit with his impression of Amra. But whatever the case, it was a dangerous situation and really highlighted the risks law enforcement face.
For sure. And the lengths these criminal organizations will go to.
Now, in Germany, a suspected anti-Semitic attack has really shaken things up. A 19-year-old Syrian man stabbed a Spanish tourist at the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. They think it was planned. They found a prayer rug, a copy of the Quran, and obviously the weapon, all on him. So they're looking into a possible religious motivation.
It wouldn't be surprising, sadly.
Thankfully, the victim is expected to survive, but he's in a coma right now.
Oh.
The interior minister condemned the attack, called it abhorrent and brutal. This comes at a time when Germany is already dealing with, rising concerns about immigration, especially with the election coming up on Sunday.
Right. The timing couldn't be worse.
Speaking of tensions, there are some really serious allegations coming out of Mali. The military government there is investigating claims of a massacre of civilians.
A massacre.
A Tuareg rebel group is accusing Malian forces and Wagner mercenaries of executing at least 24 civilians, including women and children.
Oh, God, that's terrible.
They were reportedly traveling in 2 passenger vehicles when they were stopped. Obviously a horrific allegation, and if it's true, it would be a major setback for any hope of peace in the region. Now, the Malian army has denied everything, called the claims unfounded. But this is all happening in the context of this ongoing conflict. The Malian government, Tuareg rebels, jihadist groups. It's a very complex situation.
And don't forget, Mali recently withdrew from ECOWAS, the West African regional bloc, and their ties to the Wagner group are getting stronger.
Yeah, it's a region riddled with conflict, and these allegations, if they're proven true, could make things even worse. We're going to talk about New Zealand now.
Yeah.
There have been arson attacks targeting churches there. Really shocking the community.
7 churches targeted, 4 in Masterton have significant damage.
And there's a video going around online, a man claiming responsibility, talking about anti-religious and anti-monarchist views.
Yeah.
Police are treating the fires as suspicious.
It's a disturbing development, especially considering the history there, the Christchurch mosque shootings.
Exactly. It's a reminder of the dangers of extremism and the need for understanding and tolerance, across religious and cultural divides. And just a quick update on the hostage situation in Israel. We have some really sad news to share.
Oh no, what happened?
Israel confirmed that the body returned by Hamas is that of hostage Shiri Bibas.
That's awful. Her husband was released earlier, right?
Always. It's just devastating news for him and the entire family. And to make things even worse, Israel is now claiming that her 2 sons, Ariel and Kafer, were deliberately killed while in captivity.
Oh my God.
They're saying they have evidence, which they've shared with international partners. Just a horrifying accusation that really underscores the brutality of this conflict.
I can't even imagine what that family is going through.
In the U.S. now, President Trump has made a move that's really sent shockwaves to the military. He fired Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, C.Q. Brown.
Wow, he's the 2nd Black officer to hold that position. It's a crucial role, advising the president on all things defense. Wasn't there talk of this happening?
There was. Defense Secretary Hegseth had been pretty vocal about wanting Brown removed. He criticized his focus on diversity and inclusion programs.
Right, I remember that. Is this part of a bigger trend?
It might be. Trump also fired 2 other senior officers this week, including the first woman to ever lead the U.S. Navy. And then the Pentagon announced those budget cuts and plans to lay off thousands of employees.
It seems like he's really shaking things up over there.
He is. But there's been some pushback, too. A court order temporarily blocked Trump's bans on those DEI programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Interesting. So there's definitely some tension there.
Definitely. And speaking of tension, President Trump has been publicly criticizing European leaders, specifically Macron of France and Starmer, the UK PM.
What's he saying?
He says they're not doing enough to end the war in Ukraine. He's even dismissing Zelensky's role in any peace negotiations. And this is all happening just a few days before Macron and Starmer are supposed to visit the White House.
The timing is interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, remember Starmer's pledge to maybe send UK troops to help guarantee Ukraine's security? That's a big difference from what Trump is saying. It's definitely creating some friction in the transatlantic alliance.
A tricky situation, for sure, especially with the war still raging on.
Let's shift gears a bit now. There's been a lot of talk online about plane crashes lately. A lot of people seem to think they're happening more often.
Yeah, I've seen that too, especially after that mid-air collision in D.C. and the plane flipping over in Toronto. Those images are scary.
They are. But here's the thing. The data from both the NTSB and the ICAO actually shows a downward trend in air accidents over the past 20 years.
So it's just our perception then.
Yeah.
Seeing those images makes us think it's happening more.
It seems that way. It's a good reminder to be critical of what we see, Look beyond the headlines.
Good point.
Meanwhile, in Germany, things are really heating up as we head into the election.
Yeah, that's the Sunday, right?
Yep. And the conservative frontrunner, Friedrich Merz, he's promising to take a strong leadership role in Europe if he's elected.
This election feels really important, especially since the last government collapsed. The outcome could have big implications for the whole EU.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the big issues dominating the campaign are the economy and immigration, especially with those recent attacks that were linked to migrants.
Right, and that's definitely fueling the rise of the AfD, the far-right party. Their anti-immigration message is resonating with some voters.
It's creating a tense atmosphere, for sure. There
Yeah.
was that protest against the AfD in Solingen, and then that stabbing at the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. Security is a big concern
Right.
leading up to the election.
I bet. So where does Bruce stand on all this?
Well, he's been criticized for trying to get votes from AfD supporters. He even relied on their votes to pass a motion on immigration. Even Angela Merkel has criticized him for that.
Wow, that's saying something.
It is. It's a tricky situation for him trying to appeal to those voters without being seen as aligning with the AfD's more extreme views. It's a really high-stakes election, and the results are going to have a big impact on Europe.
I'll be watching closely for sure.
All right, let's head back over to the U.S. California Governor Newsom has made a pretty bold request to the federal government. He's asking for $40 billion in fire relief funds.
$40 billion, that's a lot of money.
It is. But remember those devastating fires in L.A. back in January? They killed at least 26 people and caused billions of dollars in damage.
Right.
So Newsom's proposal, it's for everything. Debris removal, repairs, economic recovery, tax incentives, even wildfire resilience programs. It's a big plan.
It sounds like it. But will he get the money?
That's the question.
Yep.
Getting that amount approved by a Republican-controlled Congress, it's not going to be easy, especially with, well, Trump's past statements about withholding aid from California until they address their water supply issues. It could get messy.
It sounds like it.
Some big legal news now. Hadi Matar, the man who attacked Salman Rushdie back in 2022, has been convicted.
Oh, wow. I remember that. It was a shocking attack.
It was. He was found guilty of attempted murder and assault. The attack at the Chautauqua Institution left Rushdie with really serious injuries. Loss of vision, a paralyzed hand.
Awful.
He faces over 30 years in prison. This whole thing, it brings back all the controversy around Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses, and the fatwa against him.
Right. It's a reminder of how dangerous intolerance can be and how important it is to protect freedom of expression.
It definitely raises a lot of complex questions about censorship, religious extremism, the limits of free speech.
Questions that we're still grappling with today.
Back to Europe now. Swedish police are investigating what looks like, well, another case of sabotage.
Oh.
Yeah, an undersea telecoms cable in the Baltic Sea, the one connecting Germany and Finland, has been damaged.
Not again.
This is actually the third time this has happened in recent months. It's raising a lot of concerns, especially with everything going on with Russia.
Right, all the tensions since the Ukraine invasion. And there have been, quite a few suspicious incidents with undersea cables and pipelines lately. Makes you wonder.
It's like a whole other battlefront that most people don't even think about. Speaking of potential disruptions, China is conducting a pretty rare military exercise in the Tasman Sea.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Australia and New Zealand are not happy about it. They've both sent ships to keep an eye on the Chinese fleet.
I bet.
Australia is calling it unusual, and New Zealand is saying, hey, you could have given us a heads up.
A little common courtesy. Right.
Exactly. And to make things even more tense, they might be doing live fire drills. Airlines are having to reroute flights between the two countries.
Wow, that's serious. It definitely feels like China's trying to send a message.
It does. It's a bit of contradiction, though. They've been trying to, mend fences with Australia diplomatically.
Yeah.
Then they do this.
Mixed signals for sure, especially after that incident with the Chinese fighter jet, the one that released flares right in front of an Australian aircraft.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens next. Now, for something a little lighter, Trudeau, the Canadian PM, had some fun with Trump after Canada beat the U.S. in the Four Nations face-off hockey final.
I can only imagine. Hockey is huge in Canada, and with all the political stuff going on between the two countries, that win must have felt extra good.
It did. Trudeau said, and I quote, "You can't take our country and you can't take our game."
Classic.
The game itself was pretty politically charged, too. American fans were booing their own national anthem. And the Canadian singer changed the lyrics in protest.
Wow, that's saying something. Sports and politics, they're definitely intertwined sometimes.
Back to some serious news now. In Sri Lanka, a gang leader was killed in a really brazen attack right inside a courthouse.
Inside a courthouse?
Yeah. The gunman was disguised as a lawyer, used a revolver that was smuggled in by a woman. She's still on the run.
That's a major security breach. Talk about audacious. The gang leader was already in custody, right?
He was. It really shows you the level of, violence and corruption they're dealing with in Sri Lanka.
Scary stuff. Are they investigating?
Oh, yeah. They've arrested a policeman and a van driver who they think were involved. But it's a tough situation. The government's saying they're going to crack down on gangs, but this really shows how big a problem it is.
Definitely.
Now, in Hong Kong, there's been a big blow to democracy. The main opposition party, the Democratic Party, they're disbanding.
Really? They were like the main opposition to Beijing, weren't they?
They were. They held the most seats after the 2019 local council elections, remember? Those were held right in the middle of all those pro-democracy protests.
Right. Things have changed a lot since then.
They have. China implemented that Patriots Law, basically barring anyone they see as disloyal from holding office.
And that's put a lot of pressure on the Democratic Party. Many of their members have been arrested or forced to leave Hong Kong.
The party chairman says they're disbanding because of the current political climate, but it's pretty obvious it's because of Beijing's crackdown. It's a sad day for democracy in Hong Kong.
Definitely. It makes you wonder what's next for the city.
Let's talk about a controversial decision from the U.S. government. They're ending temporary protected status, TPS, for about 500,000 Haitians living in the U.S.
That's going to be a problem.
It is. Haiti's facing a lot right now. Gang violence, sexual violence, a humanitarian crisis. The UN has even said it's dangerous to send people back there.
So why is the U.S. doing this?
Well, the Trump administration says the TPS system has been abused. But critics say it's a heartless move that puts people's lives at risk.
I can see both sides, but it's a tough situation for those Haitians who are relying on TPS.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Over in Ireland, there's been a political move that's making headlines. Sinn Féin, a major party, is boycotting the White House St. Patrick's Day celebrations.
Oh.
They're protesting Trump's stance on the Israel-Gaza conflict. It's a big deal, especially considering how important St. Patrick's Day is for Ireland and their relationship with the U.S.
Bold move.
Some people are supporting Sinn Féin, saying it's a principled stand. Others, like the DUP, are saying it's going to hurt relations with the U.S.
A lot of strong opinions, I imagine.
There are. It's a tricky situation, for sure. Speaking of influential figures, you know Pope Francis is in that hospital in Rome.
Yeah.
It's not just any hospital. It's known as the Pope's Hospital.
The Pope's Hospital.
Gemelli Hospital.
Yeah.
It's this Catholic teaching hospital, and it has a whole suite specifically for popes.
Like a papal penthouse?
Kind of. It even has a private chapel and a balcony so the Pope can address the public. It's also the same hospital where John Paul II was treated after the assassination attempt back in '81.
A lot of history there.
Before we move on, let's just recap all the stuff that's happened this week with the Trump administration. It's been a lot.
Buckle up.
Okay, so we've got U.S.-Russia peace talks, a prisoner swap with Russia, the end of the congestion charge in New York, interference in the Andrew Tate case, a drop in border arrests, and then thousands of federal workers fired, followed by, get the attempts to rehire some of them. Yeah. And then there's the executive order to reduce the cost of IVF, restrictions on the Associated Press, efforts to dismiss that Eric Adams case, and cuts to benefits for undocumented migrants.
That's a lot to unpack.
And there's more. They've also talked about sending Doge savings to Americans, advance criticize Europe, skip G20 talks, slash the Pentagon budget, brought back 9/11 cancer research, showed up at the NASCAR opener, and, oh yeah, fired the top general.
Whoa, slow down. They've been busy.
To say the least. All right, let's wrap things up by taking a closer look at Friedrich Merz, the guy who's probably going to be Germany's next chancellor.
Okay, what's his story?
Well, he had a pretty interesting career. He was a rising star in politics back in the 90s, but then went off and became a corporate lawyer. Now he's back and wants the top job.
A political comeback story? Sounds familiar.
It does. And he's been making waves, especially in his own party, the CDU. He's more conservative than Merkel and wants to move the party away from her centrist policies.
But that whole thing with him collaborating with the AfD, that far-right party, that's caused some controversy.
Big time. Even Merkel's criticized him for it.
Makes sense.
It's a gamble for sure, trying to get those AfD voters without, alienating everyone else.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
High stakes.
Definitely. We'll have to wait and see what happens on Sunday. So, back to Friedrich Merz, the guy who's likely to be Germany's next chancellor. It's a pretty amazing comeback story, right? From politics to corporate law and back again.
It is, and it's interesting, how he represents a shift from Merkel's style. He's definitely more conservative.
Right. He's been pretty vocal about wanting to, steer the CDU away from those centrist policies that Merkel was known for.
Yeah.
But that whole thing with him working with the AfD, that far-right party, it's been pretty controversial. Even Merkel herself has criticized him for it.
Yeah, he's trying to walk this tightrope, appeal to those voters concerned about immigration and the economy, but, without looking like he's endorsing the AfD's more extreme views. It's a risky strategy.
It is. We'll have to see if it pays off on Sunday.
Yeah.
But no matter what, the outcome of this election, it's going to have a huge impact, not just in Germany, but across Europe. Germany is such a key player in the EU.
For sure. Everyone's going to be watching this one closely. Speaking of Europe, let's go back to that suspected sabotage in the Baltic Sea. That undersea telecoms cable connecting Germany and Finland damaged again.
This is like the third time in just a few months. It's got to be more than just a coincidence at this point, especially with, everything going on with Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, the timing is definitely suspicious. And we've seen a lot of, well, let's call it unusual activity around undersea infrastructure in the region. Cables, pipelines, you name it.
It's like a whole new front in the conflict, one that most people don't even realize is there.
Yeah.
And it highlights just how vulnerable those networks are. I mean, they carry so much data, so much energy. Disrupting them, that could have a huge impact.
A huge impact, yeah. Economic disruption, security risks, it's a big deal.
And speaking of, countries flexing their muscles, China's been doing some interesting stuff, too. They're holding a pretty rare military exercise in the Tasman Sea. And Australia and New Zealand are not thrilled about it.
They're not. What's going on?
Well, both countries have sent ships to monitor the Chinese fleet. And they're both kind of calling China out for not giving them a heads up. Australia is saying the fleet's presence is unusual, and New Zealand's basically like, hey, a little communication would be nice.
Yeah, I can see how that would rub them the wrong way, especially, given the already tense relationship between those countries and China.
And on top of all that, there's talk of live fire drills, which has forced airlines to reroute flights between Australia and New Zealand. It all feels a bit like, well, a power play by China.
It does. I mean, they've been trying to, improve relations with Australia diplomatically, but then they do this. It's sending mixed signals for sure.
Absolutely. It's a situation that deserves some serious attention, because what happens in that region, it has implications for everyone. But let's move on to a story that's a little less, tense. Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, took a jab at President Trump after Canada beat the U.S. in the Four Nations face-off hockey final.
Haha, that's great. Hockey's practically a religion in Canada, and beating the U.S., well, that's always a big deal, especially with all the political stuff going on between them.
Yeah, it was a pretty big win for Canada. And Trudeau's comment afterwards, it was perfect. He said, you can't take our country and you can't take our game.
Classic Trudeau.
And the game itself, it was pretty politically charged, too. American fans were booing their own national anthem. And the Canadian singer, well, she changed the lyrics in protest.
It's amazing how sports can become a platform for, expressing those bigger political feelings.
It is. It's a reminder that even in something as, seemingly simple as a hockey game, those political tensions, they're always there, just below the surface. Now, back to some heavier news. We have to talk about Sri Lanka. There was this incredibly brazen attack. A gang leader was killed right inside a courthouse.
Wait, inside a courthouse? How did that even happen?
I know, it's crazy. The gunman, he was dressed as a lawyer and he used a revolver that had been smuggled in by a woman. She's still out there somewhere.
It's terrifying to think about the level of, corruption that must have been involved to pull something like that off. I mean, the gang leader was already in custody. What were they thinking?
It's really exposed the challenges Sri Lanka is facing. Gang violence, corruption within the system, it's a lot. The government is saying they're going to crack down, but this attack, it just shows how big that task is going to be.
Absolutely. It's a complex problem with no easy solutions. Speaking of complex problems, Hong Kong's been in the news again. The Democratic Party, the main opposition party, they've announced they're disbanding.
Yeah, it's a sad day for democracy in Hong Kong. The Democratic Party, they were a symbol of resistance, a voice for those who wanted, more freedom and autonomy.
They were the ones who held the most seats in the 2019 local council elections. Those elections, they were held right in the middle of those huge pro-democracy protests.
Right. It's hard to believe how much things have changed since then. China imposed that Patriots Law, basically preventing anyone they see as disloyal from holding office.
And that's led to so many pro-democracy figures being arrested, forced into exile. It's a real crackdown.
It is. And the Democratic Party, they've been under immense pressure. Their chairman said they're disbanding because of the current political climate, but it's clear that this is a direct result of Beijing tightening its grip on Hong Kong.
It's a real loss for the pro-democracy movement there, and a worrying sign of what might be to come.
Absolutely. Shifting gears now, let's talk about the U.S. government's decision to end temporary protected status, or TPS, for about 500,000 Haitians living in the U.S. It's a move that's been met with a lot of criticism.
Yeah, it's hard to see how this is a good idea. Haiti is in a terrible state right now. Gang violence, sexual violence, humanitarian crisis. It's just not safe to send people back there. Even the UN has said that.
And the timing,
Yeah.
it's just awful. The Trump administration is saying the TPS system is being abused, but critics are calling this move cruel and heartless. It's a really tough situation for those Haitians who are relying on TPS to stay in the U.S. Their lives are basically being turned upside down.
Yeah, it's hard not to feel for them. They're caught in the middle of this political battle.
And it raises some important questions about, the U.S.'s responsibility to protect vulnerable people. What are the limits of immigration laws when people are fleeing dangerous situations? It's a complex issue with no easy answers. Okay, last but not least, we have to talk about what's going on in Ireland. Sinn Féin, one of the major political parties, has announced a boycott of the White House St. Patrick's Day celebrations.
Oh, wow, that's a pretty big statement. What's the reason behind it?
They're protesting President Trump's stance on the Israel-Gaza conflict. It's a bold move. St. Patrick's Day is a huge deal in Ireland, and their relationship with the U.S. is really important.
I can imagine this is causing some debate over there.
It is. Some people are praising Sinn Féin for taking a stand, saying it's a matter of principle. But others, like the DUP, are criticizing them, saying it's going to hurt relations with the U.S. It's a tough situation, trying to balance those domestic and international pressures while staying true to your values.
Definitely. It's a reminder that politics is never simple. Well, that's it for another edition of the Daily News Roundup. We've covered a lot of ground today, some heavy topics, some lighter ones, but one thing's for sure, the world's never dull.
It's not. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll be back next time to break down all the latest news and help you make sense of it all.